By early 2005, armed robberies and gangland murders were escalating at a runaway pace, and not only in Dublin. The gardaí were under severe pressure, and although doing what they could with the resources they had, things seemed to be getting worse, never better. Even when drug shipments were busted, the top people rarely got caught, and especially not Marlo Hyland. The 80s had the General, the 90s had John Gilligan, and in the noughties it was the reign of Marlo Hyland. He ruled over the drug scene, working his way up the ranks, taking the opportunity to step in when others fell by the wayside. He grew increasingly reckless and paranoid and therefore became a liability. He had to go. And the circumstances of his death just added to his legacy. That an innocent young man doing an honest day's work lost his life is just terrible. You're listening to Caught in the Crossfire, Episode 3, Operation Oak, the beginning of Marlo's end. After every interception, there were follow-up searches in one of the many houses he owned in West Dublin. Guards would often find him, casually sitting at a kitchen table with some of his men, just having a chat. He never had anything to fear, because if Marlo was there, you were guaranteed the house was clean. He never took chances by handling his guns or his drugs. He paid his men well to do his dirty work for him. The gardaí and the government were becoming increasingly desperate and determined to bring him down. A cohesive plan involving all the different branches of the gardaí, which is never an easy task, was needed. Something well funded with the full weight of the law behind it. Marlo Hyland was really good at being a criminal, wasn't he? Like, he approached it like a business.
Yeah, he approached it like a businessman, of which he was the CEO. He had this desire to get people to work together. He wanted to be a facilitator, not just in the drugs business, but in all the other underworld businesses that were going on at the time. An example of this would have been the VAT fraud, which went on back then and still goes on now. It was a way in which people would fraudulently claim back money from the state effectively. And that had become one of the big fundraisers for the provisional IRA. However, they needed businesses in Dublin and people to be involved in that. And Marlo Hyland was a trusted person to do that in the Finglas area. And Marlo Hyland liked to build these relationships, and I think it made him feel untouchable, made him feel important.
He was like the link man, wasn't he? I mean, he was even probably the first outsider to have made connections with the McCarthy-Dundon mob down in Limerick.
Yeah, I mean, I think possibly even unlike the Gilligan gang, Marlo Hyland had a national vision where he would be the head of this Ireland incorporated drug dealing business. And remember, there was a reason for that. At that time, the drugs boom had occurred in Dublin, but it was rapidly spreading across the country. And you had a few gangs that really took advantage of that. One of the primary gangs to take advantage were the Dundon McCarthy gang, who we think of as being very located in Limerick, but they were also very heavily involved in the drugs trade across Munster. Marlo Hyland had formed a particularly close connection with John Dundon in particular, and he became their wholesaler effectively, but he also became a fixer for them as well if they needed other connections.
And he even looked to the prisons to make allies. You know, he used smuggled mobile phones maybe to make friends. He visited Duchy Holland, and I think while visiting Holland, he got friendly with Desi O'Hare.
Yeah, I mean, Desi O'Hare and Duchy Holland had formed a particularly close bond actually in Portlaoise prison. Desi O'Hare, known as the Border Fox, was probably one of the most notorious Republican gunmen in the history of the Troubles. He'd ended up in prison due to that kidnapping. And Duchy Holland was in there as well for drug offences. But Marlo Hyland constantly visited him, paid, I think, 13 visits to him during his time in prison. And when he used to leave money in the commissary account for Duchy Holland, so he'd be able to buy stuff in the tuck shop, there was no particular purpose maybe to that at that point, other than that Marlo Hyland would be seen as this kind of Don Corleone type of figure where he looked after these people. When Dutchy Holland and Desi O'Hare were eventually released, Marlo Hyland would help set them up and kept them around them at all times. These were, at that point, absolutely infamous figures. Dutchy Holland had been named as a suspect in the murder of Veronica Guerin, and Desi O'Hare, there was nobody who didn't know who he was. So Marlo Hyland liked that kind of, to have that hint of danger around them.
So suppose you could say that by 2004 he was top dog. He was dealing the drugs, he was involved in car theft, armed robberies, he was supplying guns. He was using this network of young criminals that were known locally as the Filthy 50, and he'd hire them for jobs and pay them according to the profits. Of course, he was first to take the profit, the largest wedge of money, and after that, what was left was divvied up between the rest of this grouping. They wanted to be near him. They wanted to be part of his gang. And they were prepared to do anything for them. They were also a very dangerous group of young, ambitious criminals. So really, by 2004, in the previous year, we call them the Hole in the Wall gang, had got away with about €3 million in cash from these armed robberies on security vans who were supplying money to ATMs. And that was the kind of more sophisticated end of his operation. It was really, really making him a lot of money. They were carrying out reconnaissance on these ATM machines, working out what times the security vans arrived to supply the money, and literally pouncing with weapons when they did. And that money was all brought back. And I think Joey O'Callaghan has told us that sometimes that money was brought back to Brian Kenny's shed where it was divvied up. And of course, always Marlo got the biggest portion of what was divided.
Yeah, I mean, the Filthy 50 would have been, most of them would have been a decade younger than Marlo Hyland. And just like he was brought through by PJ Judge, these guys were brought through by Marlo Hyland. The armed robberies, the targeting of ATM deliveries, he kind of spotted a gap in the market. The security systems around those deliveries weren't as tight as they were for within banks, which gardaí had figured out a system for that. So there was huge money being made there. And all of that was being ultimately reinvested in the drugs business. And Marlo Hyland's connection with the Kinahan cartel, then in a degree of infancy as well, had continued to grow.
He used that money, of course, to purchase large amounts of drugs, including cocaine and even heroin. And in the 10 years after the murder of Judge, he became so powerful and rich that the Gardaí set up a special task force to target him. They'd initially set up a task force to target organised crime as a whole. And when delving into that, realised that Marlo was so big that they needed to set up a special force just to target him.
When the guards looked into armed gangs across Ireland, they realised that Marlo Hyland had a finger in almost every pie, in everything that was going on involved in organised criminality in Ireland. And so they started to target him. And it was a hugely successful operation. Within the space of a year, a huge amount of drugs and guns were seized. And that really started to apply pressure to Marlo Hyland.
In 2002, Brian Sherry was promoted to the rank of Detective Inspector and was over two of the busiest crime districts in the country, Blanchardstown and Cabra. Marlo Hyland was not only the big fish in his pond, he was also proving to be the number one criminal in the country, with his finger in almost every pie. In 2005, Operation Anvil, with a budget of €20 million, was set up to tackle organised crime. A short while later, after examining what was happening on the ground, officers realised that Marlo Hyland and his gang would require their very own Garda initiative. And so, Operation Oak was born.
When I became Detective Inspector in Blanchardstown, Finglas and Cabra, we had one really main criminal who was operating in the area, and that was Marlo Hyland, and he was involved in literally everything that was happening. It was a very dangerous situation to have just one man in such a powerful position, and he was literally pulling all the strings with all the other criminals in the area. His name was coming up in investigations all the time. At one stage, it seemed like there was nothing in this town without some involvement from him. In the end, he became too big for his boots. Hyland was also becoming increasingly violent, and to anyone he thought was double-crossing him. For instance, the gruesome execution of Andrew Shakur Dillon. Operation Oak was set up, and it was surveillance units were being used and other specialist units. And together, it did work, obviously. And throughout the beginning of 2006, the Hyland network was literally torn apart by the good work of Operation Oak. There was countless arrests and charges brought against approximately 20 members of his inner circle. And by the end of April, drugs worth at least 9 million had been seized. Not only were the spoils picked up, CAB was now involved, and they were following up on the other gang members' homes and the offices of solicitors, accountants working for them at that particular time.
Marlo was in trouble. His cash flow was drying up in spectacular fashion, and his foot soldiers were disappearing at a ferocious rate. These stresses, mixed with his fondness for his own product, saw him getting increasingly more paranoid and volatile. He was convinced there were moles in his network, people ratting him out. There was no way the guards would be so successful if they didn't have insider information. In one of many panic-stricken missteps, he arranged to have former associate and now rival drug dealer Paddy Hart executed after he dropped his kids off at their school in Raheny. But while he may have reminded his gang of what he was capable of, the guards weren't letting up anytime soon. By the autumn of 2006, Marlo's empire was crumbling. Its estimated Operation Oak seized about €20 million worth of drugs, €200,000 in cash, and countless stolen vehicles. More than 40 people had been arrested, and over half of them were facing serious criminal charges. It didn't take long before his once loyal army began to turn on him. Marlo became increasingly desperate, leading him to set up what was probably the cruelest atrocity of his entire career.
Baiba Salute came to Ireland from her home in Latvia, and she started working in a coffee shop in Ireland. She became friendly with an Irish family who invited her out for a drink, and while she was out that night, she would meet the man who would become her future husband, Hassan.
Literally like that. It just shows, doesn't it, how things can change in one instant or one evening.
It does, and Hassan was kind of a handsome man, but I suppose for Baiba Salute, she would have never had any notion of the sort of darkness at the heart of what appeared to be a handsome and
I thought she'd met her life partner, yeah. She was bowled over by him, and she was
bowled over by him, and they hooked up. She got pregnant, but it slowly emerged that Hassan was a major target for gardaí. He was a car thief. He was suspected of being a key figure in a multi-million euro luxury car racket where cars are being stolen to order. It was believed that these were then being exported to Hassan's home country in the Lebanon. And some of the people who were stealing those cars to order were people like Marlo Hyland's associates. As the relationship progressed, Hassan became much more physically and emotionally abusive towards Baiba, and the relationship split. She retained the custody of their two sons, and he could not accept that. On one occasion, he kidnapped the children, took them with him to the Lebanon, but ultimately he was sent to jail for that offence.
And that's really when people started to maybe realise who Baiba Salute was, because she did sort of public appeals about the children when they'd been taken to the Lebanon. And her solicitor, John Hennessy, helped her get those kids back. But I think that she was interviewed and photographed in news media. You know, she looked like one of those sort of just unfortunate women dealing with, obviously, an unreasonable man who wasn't able to have his children full time, so didn't want her to have them. And, you know, you'd briefly read the story and feel sorry for her. And obviously there was celebrations by her and her friends when those kids came back 10 months later.
Yeah, 10 months later. And in the meantime, Hassan was put in prison to do with car theft. So while he was in prison, he shared a cell with John Dundon. John Dundon, who was one of the most notorious criminals in Limerick. And probably Hassan, because of his involvement in this which was a major luxury car theft ring that was making a huge amount of money for criminals in the underworld, Hassan was able to develop connections with some people at the top of the criminal ladder. Now, he's always denied that he had anything to do with the murder. So it is believed then that Hassan, while he was in prison with John Dundon, spoke to him about what had happened to him, and John Dundon contacted Marlo Hyland.
What had happened to him? That he'd split up with her?
But that he'd split,
He was a bully of a man, obviously.
He was a bully of a man. He'd split up with his wife. She'd taken the kids. I don't think there was any talk of him not being allowed to see them, but that was just...
He saw it, that she had taken his kids from him, basically.
And that wasn't acceptable. And, it's a pretty rare thing for somebody to be killed over a family law issue, particularly when he did have access to those children. But that is what seems to have happened. Marlo Hyland, for all that he pretended to be a great guy who would help people out for no reason, didn't seem to have any moral qualms about helping the murder of Baiba Salute to occur. He certainly was suspected of accessing a gun, and the people who are believed to have carried out the murder were junior members of his criminal outfit.
I mean, it was November 2006, and I think her boys were asleep upstairs, and she'd stepped out of her front door to have a cigarette with her neighbour when this gunman ran up to her and shot her 4 times at close range before running off to a car awaiting BMW. But it was the murder of this sort of innocent young woman, and it was just one of those lines in the sand had been crossed. This was not gangland feuding. This was not one criminal getting, revenge on another criminal or whatever. This was an innocent woman, the mother of 2 children. Those children left asleep upstairs in the bedroom as their mother is, shot dead, left in a pool of blood on the doorstep. And the country was outraged.
The country was absolutely outraged. I mean, a woman being killed in those circumstances, particularly involving the people that were involved, I mean, it was really, really shocking. It doesn't happen often. We have had women shot dead in gangland situations, but often it's been in a case of mistaken identity. For somebody to be assassinated in cold blood while the children slept upstairs in that manner, it really sparked this outrage across the country, and it became known as the investigation progressed how deeply involved Marlo Hyland had been in facilitating this murder to occur.
And I suppose before we even go on with that, it is worth mentioning that Hassan, is now out of prison, and on a number of occasions he's been photographed in the UK where he's living with Baiba's sons, because he regained custody of them on his release from prison, and no one has ever been charged with her murder.
No one has ever been charged with her murder. The people that are suspected of carrying it out, those names are well known to police, and they're very much tied in with Marlo Hyland. But Hassan was in prison at the time when it occurred. His fingers were not on any gun or anything like that. So he came out of prison. He ultimately left Ireland. He moved to the north of England, where he continued to be involved in the car business, buying and selling cars. And his 2 sons came with him. And
free man.
He was a free man. He started a new relationship, which is always amazes me, because he used his own name and was on social media posing away.
Those boys must be adults now.
Those boys are adults now, and we're working with him in that car business. But it was really a line in the sand, and why Marlo Hyland would become involved in this, it's hard to understand, but it probably more than anything, it shows his desire to try and keep all of these people on board, because simultaneously to that murder occurring, his gang were coming under increasing pressure from gardaí.
Do you remember first hearing that Marlo Hyland had been shot?
I do remember hearing it in work. It seemed like he'd been in the papers every single week in the build-up to his murder. He wasn't being named at that stage, obviously, because of the libel case that occurred. But that kind of pressure was coming on both publicly and obviously then from talking to people living in that area. He was becoming increasingly paranoid, and all of that was being played out in the media. So I do remember it, but I think quickly, even more than Marlo's murder, what became apparent was the murder of Anthony Campbell simultaneously. And that, again, was another one of those moments where I think it caused everybody to think twice about what was going on in this country.
Hassan was the father of the two boys, and there had been serious controversy in that issue at the time. Hassan had actually brought the children over to, I think it was Syria, and he was ordered to bring them back by the courts here, and eventually did abide by that, and he served time for that.
So that obviously is a murder. It's not as if, you try harder to solve one murder than another, but because of that, her being an innocent mother, there must have been a lot of pressure on for that murder to be solved. Do you remember what happened? Or?
We do, I remember that murder very well. We were actually involved from Blanchardstown and Finglas. We carried out a number of searches up in the Ballymun area in relation to, certainly, the context of Marlo at the particular time. I remember we located a car in an underground car park in Ballymun, and on searching it, there was false floor in it and traces of cannabis in the back of a van, and then in a car, a stolen car with false plates. They were sort of used by this particular gang. On top of that, there was a car found abandoned in Swords as well, in the same area, with a submachine gun in it. All of these events were connected to the murder of Baiba.
And as you've spoken before loads of times about it, is it the organisation of the murder that makes it so difficult to solve?
It is, of course, you face a wall of silence, basically, like the Omerta. And that's the difficulty when you have it, unless you literally catch them in the act, or, you leave behind forensic evidence behind them, other than that, you take them in and they sit and literally look at a wall.
Mm.
And that was the difficulty with them. Unless you had good evidence to bring in, you waited until you got as much as you could, or ran out of getting anything.
Must be very disappointing and frustrating, those murder inquiries.
Of course it was. When I go back over the years, I look at the different murders that we were involved in, and you'd bring them right up to the doorstep, practically. But you just couldn't get across that doorstep with the Director of Public Prosecutions, because you just, it was felt that you needed extra just to get across and get enough evidence, to get a jury to convict.
The cold-blooded murder of an innocent young mum was a bridge too far for many of Marlo's formerly loyal associates. He was clearly panicking, and their belief that Marlo was losing it was cemented when just 4 days after Baiba was killed, a 26-year-old father of 3 from Drogheda was shot dead while on his way to court. Paul Ray was facing charges after being arrested as part of Operation Oak at a cocaine processing factory in County Meath. Marlo suspected him of giving important information to the guards in return for leniency. And in yet another clumsy move, Ray was shot 5 times just after getting into a car and setting off on his way to court. By this stage, Marlo was completely drug-addled and deeply paranoid. He split up with his long-term girlfriend at the end of the summer in 2006 and moved in with his niece's family, where he slept in the spare room. With a samurai sword by his bed, he refused to come to the front door or even answer one of his many mobile phones. He was also failing to pay his debts, including the fees promised to lieutenants who carried out his hits. Officers working on Operation Oak quickly figured out that Marlo himself had become a target. They warned him of the danger, but Marlo assured them he would be okay. His brother, William Hyland, would later describe at an inquest how Marlo seemed in those last few days of his life. Martin wasn't in great form. He was very depressed for 6 weeks before he was shot, he told the court. I think he knew it was coming because he was telling me to get my act together because he wouldn't be around forever. On the night of the 11th of December 2006, the once formidable gangster went to visit his former partner and their 3 kids. After being dropped back to his niece's house in Scribblestown Park, he sat up chatting for a while before going to bed. The following morning, he complained of having a headache, and so Elaine Hyland dropped up some painkillers and a can of 7-Up to his bedroom. She told him she was about to drop her kids to school, that she'd be back soon. Oh, and there were 2 plumbers downstairs, she said, there to fix the heating system. Marlo Hyland, who was 39 years old, took the headache pills, turned over in the bed, and went back to sleep. Caught in the Crossfire is produced by Crime World. Writer and producer Jane Finnegan. Producer Claude Amini. Audio editor Jason Malini. Art and graphics Enda Bulger. Executive producers Nicola Tallant and Ian Malini. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.